Hi everyone. So my talk today is going to focus on the Chinese governance context for global fisheries, and it's more of a very broad overview of some of the issues relating to seafood production, trade and consumption across China. So obviously there's some implications for coral reefs, as I've presented a lot in previous talks, particularly with reference to the live reef fish for food trade, but today is going to be a much more of a broader general look at how questions of environmental sustainability relate to the Chinese governance context. So as a bit of background first, with the massive expansion of the Chinese economy over the last 30 years or so, China's role in global fisheries production, trade and consumption has become really huge, increasingly prominent, and it's been progressively a focus of attention for policymakers and academics. So China's now the largest producer and the largest consumer of seafood products in the world. So a few stats just to highlight this. So China alone accounted for 62% of world aquaculture production by volume in 2011 and 35% of total fish production. And so there's one estimate that by 2030, China's estimated to account for about 40% of global consumption of food fish. So this rapid growth in the fishery sector has obviously come with a range of environmental challenges. So these include high levels of fishing in both domestic and international waters, pollution and high use of fish meal related to the rapid expansion of aquaculture, and the trade in and the consumption of unsustainably harvested species. And so how to address these challenges is a major global issue for marine policy in years to come. So just as a summary of what I'll briefly talk about today, so I'll introduce the general picture of environmental governance in China. I'll talk about fisheries policy in China and some of the actions that are being taken by civil society and market actors. And so the focus for all of this will be what are the implications for environmental sustainability with all of these trends. So there's a broad consensus among people working on environmental governance in China seems to be that while important progress has been made, there's many challenges remain, obviously. At the broadest level, the task has been to reconcile China's drive for economic development and poverty reduction with the need for environmental reform. So the need for economic development has usually been the winner in these trade-offs, and it's linked to the notion that the broad-based legitimacy of the regime is more closely tied to economic growth than environmental reform. The key issue is the considerable disjuncture between the legislation that's enacted and all the rhetoric that's espoused, and actual patterns of implementation and enforcement in the ground. So governments at the local level in China are usually very closely linked to the economic performance of local industries, and so this linkage means that it's typically very difficult to enforce environmental regulations, and so violations typically see relatively minimal repercussions. And there's also powerful historical trajectories over many years of environmental exploitation in China that continue to influence patterns of governance today. So in the fisheries sector, state policy is guided at the moment by the 12th five-year plan for fishery development. This has got a lot in it, but there's just a few features of the plan that I'm going to focus on here. So the first is of principles of balance between quantity of the product that's being produced and the quality of the product, which is a newer emphasis. And so this shift in emphasis is related to at least two major factors. So first, the growing middle class has led to changing food consumption practices across China and a stronger demand for higher quality product. And secondly, the significant incidence of food safety scandals over the past few years has led to widespread mistrust of the Chinese food system. It's very hard to overstate the level of concern about food safety issues in China at the moment. There's been a bunch of different scandals, including in the seafood sector. So, for example, heavy use of antibiotics in aquaculture. The regulation of food safety in aquaculture in China has typically operated in effect as two systems. So one for the international export market with higher regulatory standards designed to meet the requirements of importing countries, and the other for the domestic market with lower regulatory standards. So the government has been facing lots more increasing domestic pressure to improve the domestic food safety system in recent years. There's other parts of the plan that focus on a range of environmental sustainability issues, such as continuing to limit domestic wild capture fisheries, and the language of the ecological civilisation, which has been an important rhetorical principle espoused by the new administration. Another notable point in the 5-year plan is the emphasis on aquaculture, which is in part simply due to the sheer scale of aquaculture in China. So I think it's important to note that much of this aquaculture is actually focused on pretty relatively low trophic level species. So with regard to finfish, for example, carp is dominated. It's dominated by the production of carp for the domestic market and tilapia for the export market. There's many inefficiencies in farming though, and the demand for higher trophic level species with a subsequent greater demand for fish meal is likely to continue to expand. There's other well-documented environmental concerns with the aquaculture sector in China, such as pollution and the high use of antibiotics. Third point I'll focus on for the plan is increasing levels of support for the Chinese distant water fisheries. So there was a high-profile paper that came out last year out of UBC that estimated for the period between 2000 and 2011, Chinese distant water fisheries catch was more than 10 times what was actually reported to the Food and Agriculture Organisation. As this under-reporting suggests, one of the key problems in assessing the role of China in relation to global fisheries more generally is the unreliability of official Chinese data. So this is a long-standing problem that's been identified for a while and was highlighted earlier in relation to Chinese production statistics, where China was shown to overestimate production statistics. So for both the aquaculture and the distant water fishery sectors, domestic employment and profits are currently the most important drivers of their development. So about half of the Chinese distant water fishery catch, for example, is currently exported overseas. So the basic picture is that as government has implemented strong measures to limit wild capture fisheries in domestic waters, employment options for fishermen have declined, and so they've been expanding them into the aquaculture and distant water fisheries. So that's just a photo there of the office of the Chinese National Fisheries Corporation, where they've got a gigantic map with various points lit up around the globe where they operate, mostly in West Africa. So a shift now just to briefly talk about some trends among civil society and market actors. So in the Chinese fisheries sector, it's mostly international environmental NGOs that dominate. There's a lot of other national environmental NGOs, but tend to mostly focus on other issues. So there's been an increasing interest by international donor agencies and NGOs to do with Chinese marine and fisheries issues. So they've produced a bunch of high-profile reports, held a bunch of industry forums, and launched some consumer awareness campaigns. So two important areas that environmental NGOs have worked on in China, in particular I'll focus on, introduction of certification and domestic seafood consumption. So certification is a market-based tool that aims to shift consumer demand towards more sustainable options, and so it's been increasingly applied internationally. Globally, the Marine Stewardship Council is the most prominent seafood certification scheme. So Chinese state and market actors see economic opportunities in going green, and they worry about barriers to entry into certain export markets for their product. So as a result, the introduction of environmental certification has expanded in China in recent years. The MSC in particular established an office in China last year. There's two types of certification, and so at the moment in China, almost 300 businesses have what's called chain of custody certification. And so these are businesses which are primarily involved in the processing and re-exporting of various types of salmon and whitefish. So fish that comes in from, say, North America gets filleted and repackaged and then sent off back to Europe or back to North America. There's only one fishery that's being considered by the MSC for certification, and that's been under assessment for several years now, so it's unclear where that's going. So this means basically that a key limitation of seafood certification to date in China is that it's overwhelmingly dominated by fisheries produced for the international export market, not the domestic Chinese market. And this is the same problem identified earlier in relation to standards for food safety and aquaculture. And the reason behind this is essentially the lack of a strong domestic market for sustainable seafood in China. So a second area where NGOs have been active in the fisheries sector has therefore been in relation to seafood consumption, and particularly so-called luxury seafood consumption. So it's important to note that per capita consumption of seafood in China still remains quite lower than many other countries, such as US, for example, and Japan. And the most popular sorts of seafood consumed among most sectors of the population still remain relatively lower trophic level species, such as carp. But China is also one of the leading markets for a range of imported higher trophic level species for luxury seafood consumption, such as those on the slide there, sea cucumbers, shark fin and live reef food fish. These are typically consumed at banquets, typically associated with high status business and government elites. Shark fin soup's probably the most internationally well known out of all of these dishes in the banquets, and I think it offers a useful example of some of the complexity of Chinese domestic processes in relation to environmental activism. So the conservation NGO Wild Aid introduced a campaign several years ago aiming to persuade people to stop eating shark fin soup. So they used popular former NBA basketballer Yao Ming and a bunch of other celebrities. So the campaigns highlighted both the effects on shark stocks and the cruelty involved in the practice of finning. The past year or so has witnessed a whole bunch of reports of declines in the consumption of shark fin soup across China. Some other research we did, though, interviewing restaurateurs and seafood traders and seafood consumers, found that the most prominent reasons behind the declines in shark fin soup were likely related to other factors than the advertisements. So these factors included the increasing prevalence of fake shark fins on the market, which led to a lot of consumer distrust, a perception that shark fins were generally unfashionable and out of date, and basically consumer interest in the ecological sustainability of seafood stocks more broadly was generally not found to be a major factor influencing purchase. Since late 2012, the primary driver of the decline in shark fin consumption has likely been a government anti-corruption drive. So President Xi Jinping has strongly cracked down on the behaviour of government officials, and excessively luxuriant banqueting has been a key target. So the policy has had a significant effect on luxury seafood restaurants more broadly, and so shark fin consumption as one of these luxury types of seafoods has declined as a result. So while the consumption of certain species may therefore be declining, it's unlikely that they can be attributed primarily to consumer awareness campaigns. So this talk I very briefly introduced some of the trends and activities in the governance context for fisheries in China and what their implications for environmental sustainability are. So in formal state policy, these include the development of a range of new regulation on fisheries management and sustainability, and an emphasis in state rhetoric of ensuring balance between increasing production and the quality of the product, environmental sustainability. Among donor agencies and civil society, there's been increasing levels of engagement with China, particularly in relation to the development of traceability and certification systems and consumer awareness campaigns such as those related to shark fin consumption. But all these initiatives remain marked by severe constraints, so state policy remains subject to the limitations of enforcement that exist across environmental governance more generally in China. The voice of civil society in many ways remains constrained by the state, and their activities on fisheries in China are at the early stages of development and still marked by notable limitations. So we suggest that the development of fisheries policy and governance in China is not going to be a straightforward or linear development towards the increasing incorporation of ecological rationalisation or modernisation, which is a bit of a debate in the literature at the moment. And so while there is a growing appreciation of the environmental challenges posed by China's role in global fisheries, the limitations of the policy and governance context that we've talked about in this article means that the future is quite unclear. And so finally, I'd just note that China's role in global fisheries is also a highly political question. And so many of the problems that China is criticised for are merely local variants of practices that are common across the globe, including in developed countries. So as we've seen in international climate change negotiations, for example, China's role in environmental sustainability is closely linked to the role of other richer economies as well. And I'll finish up there. Thank you.